Um, Hi to the second webinar for today, our third day of activities in CEPAD. Today, the second webinar will discuss issues of race, sectarianism, and sectarian politics in the Middle East. However, with focus on the GCC and also on Iran as well. So our panelists will be as follow, and the following order will be as the presenter who's going to present firstly. So firstly, we'll have Dr. Mamdouh Shouman, an assistant professor of political science at King Abdulaziz University, Jeddah. He studies and teaches comparative politics and land politics. I know his dissertation was very interesting at Georgia State University, comparing land in Saudi Arabia and Oman, which is a fascinating comparative study regarding land. And secondly, we will have also Hessa Alnuaimi. Hessa is a PhD student of politics at the University of St. Andrews, where she conducts research on race, migration, and colonialism at the Arab Gulf. And this kind of research is very needed, especially from Gulfi or people from the Gulf, scholars from the Gulf, studying the effect of migration and race. Actually, this is very important way of studying domestic politics in the Gulf. And thirdly, we'll have Edward Wastnidge, who is the Deputy Director of CEPAD. He'll talk about the Iranian Shi'i diplomacy, religious identity, and foreign policy in the axis of resistance. So as we know, the axis of resistance has its own definition of diplomacy and of its own imagination of the regional order. So this should be a set of very interesting presentations. Actually, this will take us from the south of Arabia to Iran. I'm very intrigued to start with you, Dr. Mamdouh. So please take us to your presentation. I'll stop sharing my video and mute myself. Go ahead.
Okay, all right. Okay, let me share my screen. PowerPoint. Okay, camera's working, and PowerPoint. Just to double check.
Yep, that's fine. We can see it.
Okay, all right, all right. Thank you, Yad, for for introducing us, and hopefully we can contribute to this conference. It's really exciting for me to participate in my first virtual conference. Obviously, many are participating in this type of conferences right now because of the pandemic. So let's start. So basically, I'm interested well, overall it's comparative politics, but when it comes to sectarianism in the region, it's a major issue that affects politics in many ways, and specifically in Gulf politics, as we've seen right in the onstart of the Arab Spring or the Arab uprisings. We've seen sectarian rhetoric, we've seen sectarian violence, terrorism, and all that. And it's really important to just like for me to focus on this issue and how it applies in Saudi Arabia. So my research title is on societal sectarianism and tribalism, which hinders modern state development in Saudi Arabia. Okay, so first of all, across various literatures in social science research, most often than not, Saudi Arabia is described as either sectarian or tribal. This assertion of the Saudi state might actually explain state formation of the three Saudi states since 1744 to 1932, which is the third Saudi state. However, this approach will not accurately explain new political phenomenon in the modern Saudi state. Why is that? Because what I've seen is that, yes, there are other explanations on Saudi politics away from tribalism and sectarianism, but the problem is that you see that many scholars repeat or have this implicit view of Saudi Arabia being sectarian, as in Wahhabi or tribal, as how it functions, the state itself, as like the royal family being like a tribal family, so to speak. So let's go to my main argument. The characterization of the Saudi state as sectarian or tribal inaccurately misses the balancing role of the government. The issue of sectarianism and or tribalism is in fact a social issue, where the government attempts to mitigate its negative impact, and sectarianism in this context impedes development more than tribalism. What I'm trying to say here is that, first of all, these arguments that top-down arguments about the Saudi government being either sectarian or tribal, I don't think, yes, it does for a fact explain historically how the state itself used sectarianism, used the Wahhabi movement to establish the state. But other than that, right now, specifically right now in the modern Saudi state, no, it's what I'm arguing is that it's different. The problem with sectarianism and tribalism is within the society itself. It's not that rampant like in Iraq. No, it's not that rampant, but there are some issues that we face, okay, in terms of sectarian and tribalism. But going deep, okay, let me look into the literature. Of course, this is like a snapshot of the literature, not all of it, but basically the prominent studies that I've reviewed. And what I see is that I can categorize them into two categories. First one is the top-down approach, where it views the Saudi state as sectarian and views its policies as either enabling Wahhabism or using Wahhabism in order to gain more legitimacy, gain more access to various aspects within the society. That's one thing. Another thing is that when the government plays the tribal card and uses tribal rhetoric and all that, that's the top-down approach that I've seen in the literature. What I'm focusing on is the bottom-up approach. The bottom-up approach, an interesting study by Dr. Al-Kandari and Al-Hadbin in 2010, they literally focus on tribalism, sectarianism, which is what I'm focusing on in this research. And what they, well, they're actually just looking at how tribalism and sectarianism have a negative effect on the development of the Kuwaiti state. But they also describe how the Kuwaiti government and the ruling elite and how they're civilized and how they try to balance, as what I'm arguing for the Saudi state is that it's trying to balance these issues, you know, emanating from sectarian issues or tribal issues. So this is what I'm focusing on in a bottom-up approach. So it's sectarianism and tribalism is a problem within the society, but it's not that rampant, okay? what I'm hypothesizing is that both tribalism and sectarianism are similar in their impact on socialization and balkanization in the society. Yet tribalism, looking specifically at tribalism, it's open, actually. Tribalism is open to acknowledging and rectifying wrongdoing, while sectarianism is not. So when we look at the issue and we know that the problem is within the society, yes, we have tribalism and sectarianism, but from a policy standpoint, to rectify and to amend, to reform these problems, is that my research shows that sectarianism is more negative. Okay, the method that I've used is a qualitative within case comparative study. The study will utilize Mill's most similar system design to study how many similar independent variables tribalism and sectarianism share, and how they lead to a different dependent variable. An analytical emphasis will be placed on Yami tribe in the Saudi province of Najran. This is based on the uniqueness of the tribe, in which many abide by. Of course, many of the attendees know that in Najran, they're both they're Bedouins, and they are considered Ismaili, which is a sect under is a Shia sect of Islam, and of course they're both tribal and sectarian. Not all of the Yami tribe, of course. Okay, so applying the most similar system design approach to study sectarianism and tribalism and to compare between them, what I found out is that there are similar, of course, independent variables that we can hold constant, okay, which is group loyalty. Both sectarianism and tribalism, tribes and sects do have the sense of group loyalty. They share values and culture, okay? And this sense of exclusivity, they're exclusive. They don't necessarily tolerate or are open to other members other than them, of course, to join them. But the interesting thing is that although they share all these independent variables, but once you see the outcome variable, the dependent variable, is that tribalism, okay, acknowledges wrongdoing. Among them, tribes, Al-Harbi, Al-Mutayri, Al-Anizi, we have a lot of tribes, of course, here in the Arab Peninsula. When it comes to differences, they are willing to accept other, like if they do a wrongdoing in any case, and it's proven that they are wrong, they will accept it. But on the opposite side, we see sectarianism. Even if a Sunni or a Shi'i, okay, even if they know that they have done wrong, more likely they are not going to acknowledge this wrongdoing. So focusing on Yami tribe, okay, which I've already discussed in my presentation, okay. So the Yami tribe, as I said, the interesting thing about them is that they are culturally and ethnically Bedouins, yet a significant number of them are Ismaili, which falls under the Shia sect in Islam. Under an interesting occasion happened this past Eid holiday after Ramadan. Under a Twitter hashtag, Al-Madhhab al-Ismaili, which is the Ismaili sect, you'll find harsh criticism against Yamis, okay, for celebrating Eid holiday one day before it was officially celebrated in all other regions in Saudi Arabia, okay? But at the same time, you can find on Twitter and other social media outlets many poems in Najrani music and traditional dancing embraced by other Saudis. So basically, you see that this part of the society is okay with Al-Yami tribe, their culture, their their folklore dances and all of that, their traditions, and all, they can relate to them, okay? But at the same time, when it comes to their Ismaili adherence, okay, no, they won't accept that. So as you can see, it's not like other sectarian issues in other countries like in Iraq. No, it's basically, yes, we accept you because you're a part of us. The Bedouin part of you is accepted, but the sectarian aspect is not accepted, okay? So once, okay, the discussion here. So sectarianism and tribalism is a societal issue. As I said, it's a bottom-up issue. Tribes are more likely to accept differences among them and will acknowledge wrongdoing to another tribe. So basically, even if there's, as we say, like blood, like that someone murdered another person from another tribe, they're willing to tolerate and they're willing to accept forgiveness. But when it comes to sectarianism, in the name of whatever they believe, okay, the text they believe, it's like it's sacred, okay? Even if a person, either Sunni or Shi'i, believes something might be wrong, they're not, on average, they're not willing to acknowledge that, specifically the top religious figures, of course. Okay. All right. Yes. So hold on. Let me see. Okay. Yes. So sects, primarily Sunnis versus Shiites, okay, are less likely to accept differences and do not acknowledge wrongdoing, so not to be seen as tolerant to others, to the other. And the Saudi government must deal with the issue of sectarianism within the society. So basically, what I'm saying is that in the literature, the issue of sectarianism and tribalism, no, the modern Saudi state is, what I'm arguing is not. We should focus on the society. Okay, what about the society? Oh, okay, when we look at the society and what's going on, we see that we should focus on a policy perspective, okay? We should focus on reforming and trying to deal with sectarianism more than tribalism because of its stubbornness when it comes to tolerating others, coexisting with others. Of course, you know, thank God it's not a major issue, as if like a Shi'i won't drive his car and travel in Saudi Arabia. He can do that, he or she can do that. But there are some, we can say, some negative social attitudes among them. And if the government doesn't focus on sectarianism and reforming it really well, I think it would pose a really, really big issue. It will pose a threat to not only the social structure, but the state itself, the structure of the state. And by that, these are my, like the main references that I've focused on, and hopefully I'm on time yet.
Excellent, Mamdouh. Thank you, Dr. Mamdouh. Very good. But plus stop sharing your screen.
Okay.
Yep, thank you. Really excellent. I'm intrigued by the questions about how tribals in Saudi Arabia are more open towards change than sectarian actors, and how they are really, and we've seen this actually in the last couple of years, how tribals accepted this new kind of reforms that took place in Saudi Arabia, while some extremist actors really didn't comply much as a tribal. Right now, let's go to, and we will go to the discussion actually. This will, let me remind you guys that you have the Q&A section to place your questions. So please do ask your questions in the Q&A section, please. Secondly, we'll go to Hessa Alnuaimi. Hessa is a PhD student of politics at the University of St. Andrews, where she conducts research on race, migration, colonialism, and the Arab Gulf. In the UK, she conducts this research. And her title today is Decolonizing the Literature on Legitimacy in the Arab Gulf. With that, please, to you, Hessa.
Thank you so much, Iyad, for such a great introduction and for organizing this and putting it together. I'm going to try to share my screen, and hopefully you all can you all see it?
Yes.
All right, thank you so much. So to begin with, I just wanted to start by introducing my research and what it is I'm trying to do with this. Basically, I'm contributing to the literature on legitimacy in the Gulf and how, in a lot of cases, it tends to fall into theoretical camps such as the rentier state theory or traditional legitimacy. My research hopes to contribute by introducing the racialized dimensions of these legitimation methods that we see in the Gulf, and specifically I focus on Qatar and Kuwait in my research. So just to begin with, I wanted to start by discussing some of the broader issues within literature on legitimacy in the Gulf. So to start with, there's this idea of the Gulf as a place where there's no theory, where it's no ideology, it's very theoretically barren, and the actors in it aren't as political, they're more motivated by tribalism, religion, culture, and the dynamics of the rentier state. So with a lot of the work that you read, it starts off by talking about legitimacy without discussing what political legitimacy means for the actors involved, and it doesn't really theoretically engage with what legitimacy is. Part of that is due to the literature on the Gulf being defined as part of area studies. So by placing literature on the Gulf in area studies, where we study the Gulf as being particular, as being a place where we can't apply universal theories, it sort of cordons it off within social studies so that we can't apply more universal theories on legitimacy, and the literature on the Gulf itself can't really contribute to broader legitimacy debates. And you do see this with the way scholars tend to cite each other a lot of the times when it comes to literature on legitimacy. So the rentier scholars tend to cite each other, tend to build off of each other's work, while scholars working on traditional legitimacy tend to, again, reproduce the same ideas because they're citing from each other rather than engaging with broader debates, rather than placing the Gulf within a universal context. Of course, there are exceptions like Fred Halliday and many others, but when it comes to the Gulf, it remains a bit hesitant to engage with universal theories. There's also the trend of normalizing nativity and citizenship. With the Gulf, we have an area where citizenship is still very new, and it's still what it means for people. It's still being discussed, it's still being formed. And what we see in the literature on legitimacy is this idea that citizenship has almost always been there, takes it as an inherent category without necessarily problematizing it, without discussing the historical context that gave rise to citizenship. And this is relevant because so much of the legitimation methods seen in the Gulf in particular, rely on a particular conceptualization of citizenship. And it relies heavily on producing a specific type of citizen which is conducive to legitimation in the Gulf. But what we see in literature on legitimacy is this reproduction of the concept of citizenship without any critical engagement. And what that does is that it completely omits non-citizens from this conversation. In the Gulf, we have a unique situation where so many of the inhabitants are non-citizens, and we don't really see them being included as part of the conversation. They're not really seen as political beings, and part of that is deliberate. So with the Gulf, we have mostly South Asian non-citizens, and that is mainly rooted in the idea that, well, South Asian non-citizens are not going to be as political as Arab non-citizens, for instance. So they're only going to be apolitical presences. And by erasing them from the discourse, which we see in the literature on legitimacy, it tends to reproduce those exclusions without criticizing them at all. And lastly, a general trend is lack of agency. Neither citizens nor non-citizens are granted any form of agency within this literature. They're seen as being motivated by forces that are much larger than they are. So we have this idea of the rentier state, where citizens are moved towards legitimating their governments because of the rents. So because of this force that is larger than them, and because of this force that isn't really about choice, they're just being moved without any political decisions or ideological decisions. We also see that with the literature that attributes the legitimacy seen in the Gulf as traditional, because these actors are again moved by forces beyond their control. They're moved by their culture, their traditional culture. They're not really making any decisions to legitimate the government. This is something that comes from outside of them almost. So mainly in my research, I'm focusing on Qatar and Kuwait. And what we see there is sort of the worst vices of the literature being emphasized more, because they're sort of considered the most rentier of the rentier states. And they have the smallest populations, and so they're seen as more willing to legitimate their governments and more closely tied to their governments. What I argue is that we need to introduce race, and particularly the colonial conceptualization of race in the Gulf, in order to study these trends of legitimacy. And part of what I do is talk about how the rentier state theory, so the rentier state theory is based on a very realist foundation. It posits a more transactional, materialistic approach to legitimacy, and the founding texts of the rentier state theory as it applies to the Gulf is Giacomo Luciani's work. And he completely omits any discussion of ideology and nationalist myths in favor of a heavily materialistic approach. So with Luciani, for instance, he says that nationalist myths, cultivating nationalist myths in the Gulf, is counterproductive to the regime's aims. If they do produce a nationalist narrative, then it prompts citizens to feel like they're part of a nation, and so they should have a say in how their resources get allocated. Therefore, he argues these regimes are against having nationalist myths. And the literature sort of overlaps with traditional legitimacy at times. We see this idea of rents being distributed in a way that mimics patrimonial patterns in the Gulf prior to the discovery of oil. So these tribal sheikhs handing out favors, and now it's sort of this ancient tribal culture being transposed into a modern rentier state, where the regime is going to hand out favors in terms of rents to different tribes, and thereby assuring their loyalty. So in spite of the rentier state theory sort of claiming that it's a realist, more universalist approach to legitimacy in the Gulf, it still reproduces some of the more orientalist literature that talks about traditional legitimacy. Now, part of the issue with the rentier state theory, from my perspective, from my argument, is that it treats racialization as incidental to the rentier state. So it admits non-citizens as sort of inconsequential and existing somewhere outside political society where they're best left sort of undiscussed. But I argue that racialization is heavily involved in the dynamics of the rentier state. So while we see the rentier state theory attribute all social dynamics, all political dynamics to oil, that it's the overwhelming factor in studying legitimacy, it ignores the way the rentier state has produced racialized lines. So with the coming of oil, we have this sort of segregation that we never really saw in the Gulf prior to that. So, and keep in mind, I'm talking mostly about Qatar and Kuwait. This segregation where we see non-citizens sort of being moved away from the citizen minority in terms of culture, in terms of their politics, and it's a very spatial segregation where we have citizens being moved to these new government compounds where they're sort of kept together and sealed off of non-citizens. And this produces some racialized lines that aren't really discussed in rentier state theory literature. It's although this racialization sort of enables the core functions of the rentier state. So when we have a cheap labor, I don't think you can understand that without understanding the racialization of citizens and non-citizens in the Gulf. Because non-citizens are racialized as being sort of fit for manual labor, therefore we have this cheap labor, we have this widespread exploitation of the migrant class, South Asians in particular. And that couldn't be done without racialization. So here we have one of the core functions of the rentier state being performed by racialized dynamics that have been produced and reproduced from the time of colonialism. Again, this is something I touched on before, but it does ignore ideology. And the way I look at racialization is that it is a particular kind of ideology where it tends to, so racialization tends to be a call for action, a call to sort of legitimate certain bodies and delegitimate certain things. So we have this delegitimization of the past of the Gulf, where it was more heterogeneous, and legitimization of the Gulf regime as it exists now. And then lastly, it does lack historical context in terms of its presentation of the Gulf as having sort of emerged with oil, rather than discussing the historical context in which these states emerged. So in terms of Kuwait, for instance, we have the most rentier of the rentier states, where it's a small population, the rents are distributed so that citizens have access to great wealth, and it forms a good way of uniting the citizens. However, we also have in Kuwait sort of the most politically active citizenry, where the political language is a little bit more uncompromising and defiant than in other Gulf states. There's less of a tendency to self-censor, and it has one of the more active parliaments. So if we're going by the rentier state theory's logic, Kuwait shouldn't be this way. Kuwait should be more politically passive. The language should be more quietist. It shouldn't be as defiant. But that's not what we're seeing. And where my argument comes in is because we're not seeing this because of the racialization that we see in the Gulf, where citizens feel like they have their racialized interests served by the state. And this is, of course, enabled by the large population of non-citizens, which we do see in Kuwait and Qatar. And moving on to traditional legitimacy. This attributes the legitimacy of the Gulf states to traditional culture, and it tends to reproduce a lot of the Orientalist narratives about the Gulf. I think Ahmed Kana, for instance, says that whereas Orientalism has been demystified in the Middle East, the Gulf remains a holdout for Orientalism. It remains a place where you can sort of apply Orientalist narratives without the pushback you'd see if you'd applied it to other states. And this is mainly because of the way the Gulf states tend to present themselves as preservers and, in essence, reproducers of traditional culture. So it reproduces a lot of the Orientalist thinking that the Middle East is ruled by despots, and therefore they should, because it's always been ruled by despots, this is the only way they can function, and it reproduces this. It sort of uncritically echoes the state's legitimation theories. So whereas the state tends to reproduce itself, present itself, as overwhelmingly traditional, this literature tends to do the state's work for it, I think.
I'm sorry, Hessa.
Yeah.
I need to jump in. You have a minute. I've been texting you, but
I'm so sorry. I couldn't see it.
Right. I haven't seen my text yesterday, so that's all right. You just have a minute. So go ahead, please.
Okay. All right, so basically what this literature does is that it uncritically echoes these things while ignoring the racialized nature of tradition. So when we see museum exhibits, for instance, where you have mannequins dressed in very traditional white robes, performing tasks such as on dhows and boats, whereas some of these jobs were done by East Africans and people who are now considered non-citizens of the Gulf. So in talking about tradition, we need to be more aware of the racialized dynamics that exist here in the way that these exclusions tend to be reproduced in the name of tradition. So just to conclude, I've missed some things, but I should have been more aware of the time. Just to conclude, my research tries to remedy some of the faults we see in rentier state theory and traditional legitimacy theory, where it adds the dimensions of race and colonialism. And sorry for going over time, but that wraps my presentation up.
Yeah, I really very enjoyed your presentation, and when I wrote to you in the chat, I said to you that you have got 3 minutes, dear Hessa, even though I am really enjoying what you are hearing. So yeah, it was very provocative for someone who grew up in the Gulf and who knows the domestic issues of migration and sometimes human rights and also constitutional ramifications of these issues. So excellent presentation all and all, but I encourage you to think about the concept of reenterism, because I think it's I put my Eastern touch over here. I think it's a Western mostly on the reading of the Gulf development. I think as Gulf scholars, we can come up with a new thinking of understanding of the development in the Gulf out of the Orientalism equilibrium of understanding. I don't know, but this is just to discuss in the next discussion. The third, our third speaker today will take us to the west right now. I mean to the east, to Iran. We are going to the east of the Gulf. Iran, Shia diplomacy, religious identity, and foreign policy in the axis of resistance. This is the title, and it will be delivered by Edward Wastnidge. Edward is the Deputy Director of SIPAD, a senior lecturer in politics. Congratulations for this. A senior lecturer in international studies at the Open University, where he is also the director for the International Studies program. He holds a PhD in Middle Eastern Studies from the University of Manchester. His main research surely interests concern the politics and international relations with the Middle East, Central Asia, and particularly Iran. So anything Iran, just go to Edward. That being said, Edward, please.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's a very kind and generous introduction, and I could have sat and listened to you guys carry on talking about the previous paper. Some wonderful papers on this panel. Thank you for having me today. I hope I'm audible. I'm just going to only share my screen towards the end, where I give you some examples of some of the stuff I'm talking about, just to give you a bit of a flavour. I've kind of come in a little bit last minute to this, so forgive my relative lack of preparedness. We've had some really fascinating papers throughout this conference. It's really nice to be able to take part as well as actually a participant, as well as one of the organisers. And just a big shout out and thanks once again to Iyad, to Olivia, and to Elias for helping pull all this together. It would be impossible without you, so thank you so much for all your help. Okay, so I'm going to be presenting a paper today around Shia diplomacy, religious identity, and foreign policy in the axis of resistance. And this is actually based on a chapter that's going to be coming out in an edited volume by Peter Mandeville on the geopolitics of religious soft power, which is a broad kind of a global look at, a comparative global look at articulations of religious soft power across the world. It's also going to be coming out in an abridged form as a policy brief for the Berkeley Centre in the next month or so as well, so you'll be able to access it online shortly. It'll be open access there. Since the founding of the Islamic Republic, many people will be aware of this, Iran's leaders have sought to harness both universalistic and also particularistic claims to legitimacy in the Muslim world. And that began with attempts to actively export the revolution in the 1980s, and was followed up by Iran investing in building its diplomatic and religious infrastructure, expanding its religious outreach activities across the world, drawing on its position as something of a Shi'i metropole and a demonstration of its growing soft power. And Iran also translates some of this thinking into its wider international diplomacy, drawing on common themes of fighting oppression and its efforts to build links with the global south, resist US dominance in world affairs. So what I'm going to do in this kind of broad overview here is look at some of Iran's religious soft power and the ways in which elements of religious identity inform the diplomacy of the world's preeminent theocracy. And I do this by looking at religiously grounded notions of justice and how they feed into themes of fighting resistance and oppression. And that obviously informs Iran's foreign policy thinking and diplomatic outreach as well. Now, the Islamic Republic contains a range of parastatal organizations which carry out various religious outreach and soft power projection across the Shi'i world and the wider Muslim world and beyond as well. And that doesn't only take form of traditional religious activities affiliated to the Hawza, to the seminaries within Iran, but it also involves the educational and diplomatic missions undertaken abroad by the Iranian government. So in this sense, we can see how the transnational linkages associated with Iran's position as a religious hub are also used as something of a vector to enhance diplomatic relations and deepen ties with communities across the world. Now, going back to some of the sort of revolutionary principles that underline some of this thinking, well, the Islamic Republic's views on justice and really injustice as well are important here. And these are informed by a particular framing of injustice that arises from two interrelated points. Firstly, it's to do with the historical framing of Iranian political Islam that it's an ideal that draws on the religio-philosophical heritage of Shiism, and with it, the ideas of rallying against injustice and oppression. And secondly, the subsequent position of the Islamic Republic as a historically counter-hegemonic power that's often chafed against Western-defined norms in the international system. And so the idea of justice can be seen as a continual thread that's been maintained in Iran's diplomacy since 1979, and it shows an ongoing desire to maintain the heritage of the revolution, arguably. As the noted Iranian political scientist Homaira Moshirzadeh has noted, justice can be seen as providing something of a meta-discourse in the sense that it gives meaning to Iranian foreign policy in general. And this sense of a fight against oppression was key in Khomeini's thinking on justice, and I quote him here from his collection of works, his Imam. This is an Islam that repudiates oppression and an Islam in which the ruler and the people from the lowest walk of life are equal before the law. And so key to this political thought, again, and I quote again, was emphasizing a type of Islam whose standard bearers are the barefooted, the oppressed, and the poor people of the world. And so this was a form of actually quite revolutionary political Shiism, a modernist take on it, but drew on the intellectual heritage of Shia modernizers and people such as Ali Shariati. And the emphasis on kind of this populist egalitarianism saw it reviving and invoking of the Quranic concept of the Mustazafin, the oppressed, which was a term that went on to play a key role in the Iranian Revolution and also in much of its foreign policy thinking as well. So how does this sense of religious identity translate into foreign policy and diplomacy? Well, Hussein Shahabi has schematized a very interesting way in which the Islamic Republic reflects this thinking within its foreign policy by referring to three concentric circles. Apologies for not having a nice PowerPoint here to do this, but I was rather late to go into this. But so support for the oppressed starts with an outer circle of third world countries and liberation movements. Then we have a middle circle comprising the Muslim world, and then with the Shia world forming the inner circle. The ways in which this support continues to be articulated within this inner circle can be seen in its well-documented recent strategic engagements and in its religious and cultural diplomacy in the region as well. And it manifests itself, as I mentioned, in this kind of counter-hegemonic discourse that seeks to challenge perceived US imperialism in the Middle East and beyond. And we see this, utilizing this discourse in its wider diplomacy as well, not just focused on the Muslim world, but we see obviously support for Palestine, but also its close relations with Venezuela, even recent key figures' vocal support for the Black Lives Matter movement in the US and beyond as well. So it's couched in these kind of terms. But Iran acting as the protector of the Shia is an important aspect of its foreign policy, though it's far from being the only consideration in its regional outreach, and it's something that tends to be multifaceted depending on the audience in question. So it's something that's helped inform elements of Iran's recent military engagements in Syria and Iraq, alongside more kind of conventionally understood national security concerns. So, Iran felt duty bound to act in what commentators in Iran have referred to as its own war on terror, to counter against the activities of Daesh and other extremist groups in the region. But despite this kind of appeals to broader Shia identity by Iran, this tactical deployment in the region is born primarily of realpolitik considerations, I think, in terms of countering perceived hostility and the objectives of specific extremist groups that are opposed to Iran and have a kind of sectarian narrative. So this is very much, the Islamic Republic sees itself as a victim of sectarianism in the region. But Iran's involvement in those two conflicts, it has a very strong geopolitical, strategic rationale in terms of preserving its own national interests, maintaining its national security. But then religion does have a useful role to play in terms of attracting volunteer fighters, the well-known defense of Shia shrines, for example, in Syria being an example of that. But what we can see in this involvement is Iran's use of kind of what I've termed religious overlays to serve as a sort of justification for its actions. And it's drawing on these transnational linkages in rather an instrumental way. Going on now to, and forgive me if my screen's slightly playing up here, so hopefully that's not interfering. Going on to the kind of more narrow definitions, coming away from the kind of very hotly debated strategic stuff, which is all quite well known now. A lot of my research looks into kind of how this manifests itself in cultural diplomacy and religious exchange and things like that. But there's an interesting combination here where Iran is particularly active in countries or among communities where it has shared strategic objectives in addition to common religious ties as well. And there are a whole range of different parastatal organizations, foundations that Iran utilizes in this regard. So we have things like the Imam Khomeini Relief Foundation, which is one of the largest foundations in Iran that does development work within Iran amongst the poor, but also has an active international arm as well. The Ahlul Bayt World Assembly, which pulls together scholars and religious leaders from the global Shia community every 4 years for a conference in Tehran. We have the Assembly for the Schools of Proximity of Islamic Thought, which is Iran's attempt at promoting Islamic unity, bringing ulama from across the world every year in Tehran. And then a whole range of religious education as well, in terms of various colleges, places like the Mustafa International University that's based in Qom. If you go to Qom, you can see it's actually a very cosmopolitan place. We have the religious scholars from all around the world, and then obviously they go back to continue their work in their countries where they've originated from. And this is complemented by centres, educational centres. I don't have time to go into them here, but across the world as well, and various publishing houses that support that work. So coming on to, just in the last part of this, I want to come on to a specific example, and this is based on a little bit of research I did in Lebanon a couple of years ago now, actually. It's a little bit old, but it's still relevant today in terms of the similar kind of work that's going on. And that's the Islamic Culture and Relations Organization. This is a bit of a case study here. This organization are a noteworthy actor in terms of projecting Iranian soft power, not only amongst Shiite communities worldwide, but also more broadly, because they run Iran's cultural diplomacy initiatives, rather. And they run Iran's cultural bureaus abroad, and they have a particular focus on the Muslim world, but also operate in non-Muslim contexts. And they act as a base from which Iran's cultural attaches, which are known as cultural counselors, carry out their work. And an important thing to note here is that the ICRO they operate independently from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs run Iran's embassies, the main sort of high-level diplomacy abroad. But the ICRO ultimately report directly to the Supreme Leader, but really are run through the Ministry of Culture and Islamic Culture and Islamic Guidance. And they essentially operationalize Iranian soft power through the sponsoring of various cultural events and collaborations in the countries in which they operate. And you can see examples of the kind of work that the ICRO do in Lebanon, for example, where they sponsor numerous cultural and artistic events. And although much of their work is based on religious events, Ashura celebrations and the like, there's also commemorations rather. They're also highly active in cultural production work, and especially work that ties into the notion of the axis of resistance. And as we know, the axis of resistance is the alliance of Iran, Hezbollah, Syria, and at times certain Palestinian factions as well, against Israel, the United States, and their allies in the region. And the kind of work they do, which I'll show you some examples if my computer allows it, it highlights the kind of continued significance of core revolutionary ideals around fighting injustice that are rooted in the modern political Shiism of the Islamic Republic. In an interview I was fortunate enough to carry out with the Iranian cultural attaché in Beirut, he noted that the cultural dimension of the idea of resistance is part of Iran's foreign policy, and it informs the relations between Iran and Lebanon. So that's where the emphasis is very much tie into that wider picture as well. And that's a kind of repurposing of the revolutionary vanguard role that Iran cultivated in the early years of the Islamic Republic. And now Iran is, broaden that to see itself as a kind of the hub of resistance against Israeli and US policies in the region. And that has a wider wider scope as well. So I'll just try and share my screen now and show you some examples.
Eddie,
Yeah.
You got 2 minutes to share.
Okay, perfect.
Go ahead, please.
Thanks. I'm just trying to share my screen. Unfortunately, I've got one of these touch screens and it's playing up a little bit. Bear with me a minute if I can share it. Typical. It's been working fine all week, and the minute I present, it's not allowing me to share it. Okay, it seems I can't share that, which is unfortunate because what I had was some examples on there.
Eddie, try it now.
Yeah, it's a problem at my end, Ed, I'm afraid. It's the I have a touch screen and just once a month it freaks out slightly and it won't allow me to flip between screens, so I actually can't even see the Zoom screen now. So I'll just wrap up and if I get a chance I can show you the slides later. But they're really just examples from various art events that the ICRO hosted in Beirut, which draw on different themes. I'm not going to try and explain the artwork, it's going to be a bit difficult. And I had some snapshots of the kind of other activities that the ICRO are undertaking in Lebanon. So they facilitate various art exhibitions that have resistance themes or themes of solidarity with the Palestinian cause, revolutionary art exhibitions, things like that. They also cooperate with Hezbollah in terms of some of their cultural production output as well, with the cultural centres there. But unfortunately, I can't show you that. But I'll just quickly sum up. I think the organisations such as the ICRO and the wider religious and cultural and religious outreach of Iran play an important role in helping cement the transnational religious links between Iran and the wider Muslim world. And as I mentioned at the start, these wider transnational linkages are, developed as a result of Iran's position as a religious hub, and they can also help Iran enhance its diplomatic ties with communities across the Shi'i world. But it's an aspect of Iran's foreign policy and diplomacy that's very multifaceted and complex, and it combines religious soft power projection and cooperation along with its own national security concerns. So it's a very interesting area where the two intersect. And as the primary example I've discussed with the ICRO, it works very much in the cultural domain, but it helps amplify narratives that are sometimes based on religiously defined notions of fighting oppression and injustice. And it synthesizes these with wider geopolitical concerns, as seen in its contribution towards resistance-themed activities in Lebanon and the wider Middle East. And I think ultimately the outreach and the development of these kind of organizations operating across the world, of which the ICRO is just one example, I think highlight the complex and multi-layered articulation of Iran's combined spiritual and political mission in global politics. And I'll leave it at that.
Very excellent presentation, Eddie. I don't envy you trying to explain Iran geopolitical tools, ideational and ideological ones, to attract the resistance axis in the Middle East and beyond the Middle East, because this culture really runs deeply in the Iranian Revolution. So really 15 minutes wouldn't be share all of this. I really know this because I work on this, so it is a dense subject. But this leaves me with 7 minutes of me questioning you guys, because I planned for the question session to be for 30 minutes, and we have 3 panelists, so I have 7 minutes to ask you guys. Firstly, to Mamdouh, you argue that al-Qabila, or the tribe in Saudi Arabia, is more open than the sect or the sectarian actors, be it Sunnis or Shias. What does that do with the development of the state, given that both studied in the public schools and public universities, mostly had public education, and to a certain extent they raised in the same cities? Actually, they were neighbor in some cases. So I need to know the distinction and why this happened, why the tribal links or linkage was not manipulated, but controlled, or manipulated by the state easier than the religious or sectarian one. To Hessa, about the مفهوم الرعوية or the rentarianism in the state, and also relating it to migrant and workers and foreign workers. Do you think this is a constitutional issue? Is it a structural one in the Gulf state constitution, or do you think it's a policy, public policy issue? Do you think that there must be a concession or a new laws that cover the minorities or the workers' role in the society, or it's a public policy issue that can be remedied by state policy? Is it a constitutional or is it a public policy issue, if this distinction even makes sense to you? To Edward, about Iran's role post the Arab uprising, being the leader of the axis of resistance. How do you evaluate this role? In my opinion, is deteriorating, but how do you see it? And how Iran could build in the future or on being the leader of the axis of resistance, especially after the aftermath of the Arab uprisings, how it can continue leading towards that role? Doesn't it need more opening, more liberalization, so it can lead towards that end, or it just can continue sticking to its old ideology? To you guys, start with Mamdouh. Please, Mamdouh, go ahead.
Okay. All right, thank you for the question. So I'm gonna answer your question, and then when we're done, we'll go to the other questions, right? Okay, all right. Is my screen?
It's working.
It's working? Okay. All right, for your question, first of all, the argument that I'm making is that it impedes development in Saudi Arabia, this issue of tribalism and sectarianism, specifically sectarianism. Why do I see that? Is because, well, Saudi Arabia is opening up right now. It's opening up. The Vision 2030 is all about diversifying the economy. Diversifying the economy entails what? Foreign direct investments. Okay, foreign direct investments mean that there has to be let's say an acceptable level of tolerance and coexistence within the society itself. So why don't we work on this first, then we can I'm not saying no, simultaneously we can work on this issue here. And I'm not saying, again, I'm not saying it's a it leads to like a major issue of violence between the sects here in Saudi Arabia. No, it's not like that. But the issue that I'm focusing on is that, okay, we can fix this here at home, and at the same time open up to other nations, okay, so they can invest here, so we can be more tolerant to others, which we do, but we have to work on some issues. Of course, we're not going to be idealistic. Of course, there is no like an idealistic nation, but at least we can acknowledge this problem and work towards that. It does have an impact on development, because basically right now in the age of globalization, although I doubt from the pandemic right now if globalization will succeed liberal globalization as an economically liberal globalization, but if you want to market your state, you have to market your state. You have, what do you have on the menu? You have a lot of things on the menu, right? In that menu, you have to show that the society is more tolerant, is more open to others, right? This attracts tourism and many things you all know about. And this is why I see it does impede development in the country itself. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Mamdouh. To Hessa, if you may, the question about rentarianism and its relation to the migrant workers.
I'm Really sorry, I missed your question because my computer shut down for a bit, and I managed to get it back up, but I also can't see the other question at the questions on the Q&A. So
Alright.
that's my fault. I'm sorry.
If you want to, okay, I'll ask you this question. Do you think that the rentarianism concept is fully applicable to the Gulf states, and does it evaluate the situation of the migrant workers in the Gulf? And is it to remedy this situation of migrant workers, do we need public policy procedure or constitutional one? Is it a constitutional problem, or is it a public policy enforcement problem? That was my question.
I think as it pertains to non-citizens, we have a very, the problem is in the foundation of these states, and that very much is tied to how the British approached the Gulf. So what we have is a structural issue it is very difficult to remedy. Because with the advent of colonialism, of course, some people were excluded from citizenship and others were granted citizenship. And that has a lot to do with the way the empire approached the Gulf. So we really need to go back to state formation and undo some of the issues that were there from the very structural issues. So issues that were there from the foundation. It's only now that we're seeing it bubble up more just because of the greater number of non-citizens, the growth of
what do you think of the Kafala Qatari new law? Is that a kind of remedy to the situation? Go ahead.
I think it's become sort of, with the kafala, we sort of tie all the issues with migrants to it. So it becomes this catch-all terms. If we reform this, then everything's going to be fine. But these are structural issues. They have to do with global inequality. It's not particular to the Gulf. So I think, and part of, focusing on kafala has to do with presenting this issue with migrants as something that's very cultural. Oh, if we just remedy this part of this culture, then everything will be fine. But this is about global inequality. People are coming to the Gulf because of global inequality, and we have to situate it within a global context.
Right. Fair enough. Very good answer. Edward, to you regarding the Iranian utilization of the axis of resistance post the Arab uprising, how it was affected negatively, and how it can build a future that is more open toward an axis of resistance. So changing or coining the axis of resistance post the Arab uprising.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I didn't see the question, unfortunately, because I had to reboot my computer. I've also had some issues here, but I'm back and hopefully visible and audible. So in terms of the sort of success of it, well, it proved very adept at cultivating these alliances, these networks. Obviously, post 2006, we have this kind of high watermark of the perception of Iran in terms of its support for Hezbollah, and then the perceived waning of that after the Arab uprisings, due in large part to the Syria conflict. And that's something that affected the Axis because you had Hamas as part of that, and then as a result of Iran's involvement in the Syrian conflict, you have them essentially withdrawing. However, that's something that's changed again. We've seen that change again in the last year or so, which is a big plus for Iran because if it can have such a big Palestinian faction, the links with PFLP and Islamic Jihad will maintain, but with Hamas being such a core and powerful actor, to have them kind of back in the fold, as it were, it is a big plus for Iran because it helps add further weight and legitimacy to their support for the Palestinian cause. So I think the nature of the alliance, I mean, moving towards it. This is a sort of non-traditional security alliance in many ways, and I think it's a different type of alliance network, but it certainly can be considered as one. And I think it's one that needs more scholarly attention and theorizing as well, because we're looking at a different type of alliance here with strong kind of ideational slant, but with very real kind of security concerns at a national level for Iran, but also in terms of the various communities and factions that are part of that. I think the other development that we've seen since the Arab uprisings have been, and certainly in the last couple of years, have been the increasing importance and weight of Hezbollah in this equation, and that's partly to do with its experience gained in the field in terms of being active in Syria as well, but also the increasing role it has in acting as what Amal Saad refers to as a sub-state, sub-regional power in its own right, because it. We talk about proxies, but this denies groups such as Hezbollah their own agency. Yes, of course, the links are very real with Iran, and there's no secret in that from both sides. But these are powerful forces within their own right. The same goes for BMFs in Iraq as well, that have their own local national concerns, and I think that's something that we're starting to see now. And so it's kind of moving towards again, I hesitate to use the kind of traditional kind of terms of sort of multilateral security alliances because it's very different. But we're moving towards, a more even spreading of kind of leadership and responsibility within that, although Iran still acts as the hub for that. In terms of opening up, well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I don't know who asked that and where it came from because I missed the preamble, but it's a really interesting way to look at that, particularly in terms of, trying to move from being a kind of, I wouldn't say anti-status quo, because actually, as Olivia and Luciano very adeptly pointed out yesterday, Iran does look to seek to preserve the status quo on its own terms as well. So I think we can't say it's an anti-status quo alliance, but it's one that is kind of revolutionary in its outlook in many ways, and I think. It's not to everyone's liking for various reasons. So I think it's opening up element. I think what I mentioned at the start, the Palestinian kind of links, I think is probably where we'll see more emphasis, I suspect, and that could help its cause. But we see this. There was an event recently held in Baghdad in January, a conference of resistance scholars and ulama. And that was, cross sect. It wasn't sectarian nature. So I think that they're trying to sort of emphasise the kind of wider unity discourse that comes from Iran as well. But whether there's an appetite for that amongst regional states, we don't know.
Fascinating. Thank you very much, Eddie. Excellent answer. Here we come to the most tense part, where I read academic questions for academic questions to be answered. Okay, so let's start with Dr. Mamdouh. There are a set of questions that directed toward you. Let's start with the one from Simon Maben. He says, fascinating paper. There is a fundamental issue here in terms of the process of inclusion and exclusion, operating within and across different levels of analysis. What are the repercussions of these in inclusion for the broader idea of an inclusive political project? What is it about sects that makes or that make those identities stickier or more stubborn than tribalism? Okay. It appears that you view the Saudi government as the possible savior of tribal/sectarian division. What about bottom-up processes of the desectarianization? And then you have a question from Francisco, and then you have a question from Aisha. So either you go and answer the three questions together, if you prefer, so, Dr. Mamdouh.
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, I've written them down, so I think I can answer all the questions. Okay, so starting with Dr. Simon, Okay, thank you for your questions. First of all, the repercussions of the exclusion, all right, and the broader idea, of course, of inclusive political project. To start off, the monarchy, the political system itself, it's not a democracy. So it's not. We can't say. You've reminded me, of course, of Leiphardt's consociational configuration. So I don't think it would work. In the end, it's the country. It's the politics of it. It's authoritarian. Yes, it is authoritarian, as in the authority itself monopolizes politics. That's what I think that how the country, or sorry, how the government can deal with this, the issue of inclusion, is being a meritocracy. That's basically focusing on merit, okay? Regardless of whether sect, regardless of whether tribe. It's as if right now, if you see in the hiring process in Saudi Arabia has changed dramatically from before. Even scholarship is not, it's not based on tribe, it's not based on sect. Everyone, literally everyone who meets the requirements can apply and go abroad to pursue his or her graduate studies, or even undergraduate studies. So meritocracy is key here. Why sectarianism is more separate? Because the problem is it's based on belief. It's based on things that are they're not empirical. You can't see them. It's something in the day after what will happen. And again, this might be, I might be wrong, but this is a personal view. What I see is the problem is these sects in Islam is that they always go along with their sheikhs or their religious figures. They move away from the Quran. Okay, they move away and they go read in depth in these books as if it's like gospels, you know, written about the religion itself, written about the Prophet itself. So and they sanctify it. They sanctify it and they put as if a religious figure, if he wrote something, it's as if it's a religious verse in the Quran. So it has this this sanctification of the. So that's why I think that's the stubbornness is people are afraid. People followers of those sects are afraid that they'll go to hell if they don't, if they agree with the other. And of course, religious figures, of course, they do that because they want their position in society to not be shaken. You know, they don't want to be considered from their followers as if they're too lenient. Okay, hopefully I answered. And top down, bottom up in terms of these sectarianization. Again, I think it's within the government itself. It can continue its merit-based hiring, its merit-based even projects. Okay, even granting projects to others and companies and all that. And of course, right now it's more costly. You know, it's more costly for the government to use and utilize tribal issues or sectarian issues. It's really costly right now. Okay, and for Dr. Francisco, tribe, yes, it has been used to some extent in Iraq. Yes, in the end, in foreign policy, I kind of lean towards realism. So basically, the country has to maintain stability in the region. So at its disposal, it has it can use the tribal card if it uses it to maintain stability. It's a thing. Empirically, they do. Yes, they do. Like America uses this notion of democracy and it will free the world and all that. Yes, it does. It uses it for foreign policy objectives. Okay, last question, how to address, Dr. Aisha, how to address sectarianism? Yes, I think I've answered it in my answer to Dr. Simon. Lastly, yes, yes, I do say it's being instrumentalized. Tribalism and sectarianism, it was used and utilized by the state before. Yes, it was used, okay? But like Wahhabism was necessary for state formation. It has negative issues, yes. It has negative consequences, yes. But right now, again, it's costly. Cost and benefit, it's costly to capitalize on sectarianism and capitalize on tribal use of tribal, using tribes as tools. So yes, it's more costly. Right now, I think for the government itself to succeed, for the 2030, the vision itself to succeed, it has to, the bureaucracy, okay, the bureaucracy itself has to be neutral. Of course, no bureaucracy can be 100% neutral, but you know, leaning towards neutralism and being more efficient, being more responsive, based on merit, not sect nor tribes. Hopefully, I answered the questions.
Very, very brilliantly answered, Doctor. And we'll come back to you in the second round, actually explaining why it's hard for even religious people to distinct themselves from the previous, you know, rhetoric. As you mentioned, it is not very easy to shift.
Yes.
I want to go back to this after.
Okay.
Right now, let's go to Hessa. Hessa, there is a question, a good one from Aisha Rashidi, and there is another one as well from Francisco Belcastro. So let's start with the one from Aisha. Says, thank you very much, Ms. Hessa, great presentation, and I am sure a lot of interesting results will come out of the comparison of both cases of Qatar and Kuwait, where usually they are lumped into the same category. Glad to see that you are showing the difference among them. My question are, if you don't mind, can you illustrate further on the link between the race element in enhancing their entire state theory, regime legitimacy? So how this system of race differentiation enhance their entire state system. Second question, on the national identity narrative production and control within the region, which is mostly under the control of the state and government. Are there any different, and in the national rhetoric after the Gulf crisis, especially in the case of Qatar, it seems to be more included of the non-citizens. Yes, this is what I meant by the new Kavala, I don't know, system. Yeah, new non-citizens, including within the Qatari fabric, lessening restriction the internal policies of residency and opening of the Mashrib museums that is of the first time mainly focused and acknowledged of the history, etc. Okay, that's regarding identity from Aisha. The second one, if you may, is from Francisco. Thank you for excellent presentation, Hessa. Fascinating stuff. He asks if could you just build a bit more on the relation with their entire state theory in particular. What would you save it of? What you save of it? I know you are critical of it, but are you there? Are there elements you could or would incorporate or use? Or is the issue with the foundation basis of the theory? So is it the basis of the theory, or you can incorporate the theory and use it and utilize it in your research? So start with whatever. Bless you. Start, please.
So I think with the rentier state theory, it's become sort of fashionable within the literature now to sort of criticize it, and because it does lend itself easily to criticism. I think the main issue with the rentier state theory that sort of acts as a bulwark against any changes is that at its foundation, it argues that the social and political dynamics of the Gulf are based on oil. So Hazem Biblawi's work, for instance, which is a foundational text, it says that the role of oil revenues is so overwhelmingly obvious that it can be approximated to be the cause of other activities. So the basis of it, the foundational texts tend to fetishize oil as being the only, that oil is king, there is no other social reality in the Gulf. And that's the main issue with the rentier state theory. If I had to pick something about it that I would try to incorporate, is maybe Luciani's assertion that the Gulf monarchies are non-national states, which are suited to be allocative states because their origin naturally restricts the number of people who have a say. I think this is the only time you actually get someone in this theoretical tradition sort of just acknowledging that state formation is very important here in the way that who gets citizenship and who is denied citizenship is foundational to what the Gulf state is. And I hope that answered the question. For me, it is a very foundational issue to the rentier state theory that it's very difficult to reform it in a sense because the foundation is so flawed.
Yeah, and there is the other aspect of Aisha question, the second aspect on the national identity narrative, production and control within the region, which is mostly under the control of the state and government. Are they any different in the national rhetoric in Qatar after the crisis, especially with non-citizens? Mm-hmm. How they changed the national identity of Qatar?
I think the Gulf crisis was very interesting for me in terms of how the nationalist narratives responded to it. Because they are very similar states. The Gulf states are very similar in their state formation. But it's very interesting to me the way they've responded to the crisis. And part of what Qatar has done is, and which is very sophisticated, is that it's focused more on its global connections rather than its connections in terms of the nationalist and cultural narratives. It focused more on its global connections, on presenting itself as more palatable to Western eyes, especially. So in acknowledging slavery, the history of racism and all of that, in a way, it seeks to differentiate itself from the other Gulf states. We're more progressive, we're acknowledging these things, and it is a very sophisticated strategy. And for the other part of Aisha's question, I mean, I hope that answered the first question, but the link between race and enhancing the rentier state theory, the rentier state's legitimacy, for me, I think it's very difficult to split the rentier state from racialized elements of it. So I think the rentier state has produced racialization and it's benefited from racialization. It's heavily tied into it because the forms of exploitation we see in the rentier state would not be possible without the racialization, without racializing South Asian non-citizens as more suited towards labor, more it becomes easier for people to accept the exploitative practices seen here.
Very convincing answer, actually. Yeah.
Thank you.
So let's go to Edward right now. Eddie, you have a set of questions that are multiple and different. So let's see from where should we start. Um, Samira asked, thank you very much, Eddie, for the great presentation. To what extent do you think justice and Mustafizing narratives justifies Iranian prisons in Syria post 2011? Is it more about geopolitical issues or resistance against Israel? And another question from Umar Munassar. To what extent you could expand on the application of axis of the resistance culturally to Yemen and Houthis? You can start with those two and then we'll see.
Okay, great. Thank you, and great questions. Thank you, Samira, especially. I think it's a very interesting one that and this might feed into another question I've seen, so forgive me if I sort of repeat myself, but I think with the Syrian case, when we're looking at these notions of fighting oppression and injustice, this is pitched in the very broadest sense, and so the narrative, as far as I understand it, and this is really in terms of the very high level narrative, there's obviously more that goes on in a very lively public policy debate within Iran itself over these issues, but if we're talking about the kind of, the kind of narrative that's broadcast to the world from Iran, then it's about fighting injustice on this global level, so fighting the oppressive powers. Israel is very much key within that. So I think there is a strong geopolitical angle to that. But what happens is that you get these kind of ideational factors come in, these religious factors come in, which help serve as a justification. It's a way of pinning it to core revolutionary ideals, for example, which obviously have a great deal of currency back home among certain sectors of the Iranian polity and population. So it's about both in a sense. I'm kind of fudging the answer here, but I think ultimately, the two are very much intertwined. You have this fact that it gives it kind of additional meaning. It's not just about Iran's national security, although it is, because you have comments, as one general referred to Syria as effectively an additional province of Iran, but then you have this other element there as well. You have the channeling of shrine defenders as well, because of the importance of the Zainab shrine in Damascus, for example. So there's that kind of element of seeking to enhance a kind of notion of spiritual security as well within that. And it's pitched in terms of that kind of broader sense. I think fighting terrorism, fighting extremism. This notion of being a victim of sectarianism and really taking part in war and terror against extremist forces. So this kind of reuse of that language. On the Yemeni side of things, we had a great presentation on Yemen, which I'm sure our attendee probably saw as well. And this is something that's much more recent, and the links are sort of growing all the time, I think, with the Houthi movement, but I can't really speak from the Yemeni side that much because I'm not really an expert on Yemen, but the kind of support and that the Houthi case is highlighted, in certain cultural outputs. If I can share my screen for 1 minute, I can show you a very good example of that. May I do that just for a second, just for this question, because I couldn't share it before.
Yes, please.
Yep, because I had it on my presentation. I think this will emphasize exactly the type of thing that we see. And this is from a caricaturist's exhibition that took place in Beirut a couple of years ago. I'll look on from that. So if you can see here, we have, I'll try and, can you see if I zoom in on that? Is that showing? Yeah. This is one of the art pieces. It was the Resistance Art exhibition. We have the Yemeni flag and the traditional Yemeni dagger there. The notion, tying it very much to the notion of resistance, and this quote from Khamenei at the bottom saying that the people of Yemen have been oppressed and we support the oppressed as much as we can. So it kind of demonstrates how, even within kind of elements of cultural production work, artistic work, coming from Iran, that those narratives are very key, and we have similar things. This is just another example of the artwork you can see here. ISIS and Israel being two sides of the same coin, effectively. The American funding of ISIS below there. One final example, again, of this. This is another piece by an Iranian artist, which is a very macabre volleyball scene, but we have the perceived reactionary powers of the Gulf. Interestingly, Qatar is included in there. This is pre-Gulf GCC split. I think this was done, but lobbing bombs on the defenseless Yemeni people and the tools of British and American soft power and BBC and CNN on the sidelines there. So it very much forms part of the Iranian narrative to group them within this, and it helps its cause in a fairly low-cost way, I would say. Yeah.
Right, very excellent, Edward. Actually, the best time to share your data, because we got the idea behind them better than the presentation, so it was perfect timing, actually. So let's go to the next questions, guys, and back to the normal order, unless anyone want to add to the answers before. If any doesn't want to, let's go to the further questions. So we'll have questions for Dr. Mamdouh again, Dr. Shouman. Okay, Francisco asks, wondering whether, building on your argument on tribalism, would you also say that the tribal dimension is used by the state or the Saudi state as its external relations? If yes, how? How so? Does this strategic use also shapes or has shaped the perception of the role of KSA in the region? I would say to you, Francisco, not much, but let's see what Dr. Mamdouh says. Let's look for another question for you, Doctor, before we jump to you.
I think I've already answered his question. This one here and Aisha's question.
Okay, so no other questions you want to answer?
Looking here, I don't think there are other questions.
So what ideas do you think that your presentation holds, or the thrust of it, that you want to add to our discussion today?
It's just basically, the thing is that describing. I think the description or the in the literature and empirical research that usually depicts Saudi Arabia as being a purely Wahhabi state, okay, and the government itself being Wahhabi, and it follows strictly like Ibn Taymiyyah. No, I don't think it's obsolete right now. Things have changed. It's not as if that they've changed just because of the nature of development, the nature of advancement, and being more global. No, that's one aspect of it. But the other thing is that, as I said before, it's more costly right now to engage in this nature. These how can I say, these old ways of governing, somewhat based on religious texts that actually do more harm than good. See Iran, for example, how it's still stuck to that,
Sorry to interject. Is it a new social contract that you're arguing for?
Well, look, if it's a new social contract, then we should focus. Well, taxation will go up, and once you have a big middle class, going back to Barrington Moore, yes, middle class is essential in changing of the social contract. Actually, Hessa's work is. I've actually read a lot on frontierism. Actually, just to mention, fascinating work by Edward and Hessa, but specifically Hessa. My dissertation advisor was Michael Herb. I think you've came across his work since you've read intensively about the rentier state. So the change in the social contract itself, it's once you see the private sector being very, very powerful and not dependent on the government, as almost all Gulf countries, the monarchies, of course, we have the private sector is highly reliant on the government. Once you see it being independent, once you see the number one employer in the country, then I would think economically the social contract might change.
Okay, then it is the economic factor that will lead that change. Excellent answer. So let's open the discussion then, group, colleagues. Hessa, anything you want to illuminate that your presentation didn't, or you want to add that your paper gonna discuss, or new ideas regarding the same subject that you want to just shed lights on?
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity, actually, because there are a few things that I didn't touch on, which I think might be important. And thank you to Dr. Mamdouh as well for his kind words. I think there was a question about the conflict between modernity and these traditional regimes, and how that fits into my research, or how I contribute to that. I think for me that that discussion, that distinction between modernity and traditionalism is misconstrued when it comes to the Gulf.
Okay.
Because it assumes that the tribal sheikhs are simply holding on to their social structures, and then it's being transposed into a modern state system. The regimes in the Gulf perform very modern functions. I don't think they're as restricted by tribalism as some of the literature makes them seem. I think they're very modern states, and assuming that the sheikhs of pre-oil Arabia, the sheikhs of empire are the same ones that exist now is very misleading. I think James Onley, in his historical review of it, says that the sheikhs of the pre-oil Arabia were much more, their authority was much more contingent and frail, and it wasn't as absolute. And it's only that when we have the colonialism and state formation and the creation of the modern state system, that the tribes that happen to be powerful at that very moment, their authority became consolidated.
Mm-hmm.
So I think with that question, we need to introduce colonialism as a very important factor, which really informs how much the power of these sheikhs has changed. And it's not really that they're the same traditional ones. It's not really that they have the same social structure and social and patrimonialism and all of that. I think we just need to understand them as very modern.
Yeah.
And I think I got some, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh no, I just, because someone, I don't know who it was before, because my computer also shut down. So I think someone said, if I asked if I would recommend any scholars. And for me, I think Adam Hania is very important here, because he incorporates migration and class. And he rejects some of the more orthodox approaches to the region, as well as Omar al-Shihabi.
Yeah, Omar al-Shihabi is excellent.
Yeah, and he in his work Contested Modernity also incorporates colonialism and migration, and he sheds the light on non-citizens as important political presences within the Gulf.
Yeah, no, those are excellent readings, actually. Okay, then to Edward, any ideas or further explanations or recommendations, or the way the paper will go, or the way the paper won't go to, or
Thank you. Putting me on the spot there. No, well, the paper's already finished, so Unfortunately, I can't take any critique on it because I can't change it. But no, of course, I'm always open to critique. But it's already going to be published, so keep an eye out for it if you're interested in that. But no, I mean, this is just one element of my research, which I'm looking to take forward. I think there's many other avenues to explore within this, in terms of alliance building, in terms of questions of religious legitimacy and authority. It hopefully speaks to lots of different angles. I've not really covered any deep theoretical angle within this as well, but it's also useful in terms of providing empirical test cases, I hope. But what I'd just like to say, I mean, I just think it's been a real pleasure being on a panel like this. Although they may be seemingly disparate papers, I think they have a common theme in terms of drawing together alternative conceptions and ways of understanding regional politics and questions around citizenship and all of these tribalism, sectarianism, how religion is operationalized and used on many different levels. So we have really interesting different levels of analysis here, which has been really rich. And so I think there is some sort of interesting cross-cutting things across them, even though we're coming at very different angles, and shining light on really important regional voices. I think I say this as a white Western man sat in Manchester talking about Iran, but I think it's really important to have those voices. It's just exactly what this conference is all about. So I'm really happy to have been part of it. That's all.
Thanks a lot, Edward. Thank you very much. All right, then. Let's have another look at the questions. All righty. Simon asked Hessa, can you elaborate more on the Gulf side of Orientalism, please? It strikes me that there is tension between tradition and modernization process taking place. If you didn't answer this question, please do answer it, Hessa. Have you?
I think I just did.
You did answer
it or something. I did answer it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Hopefully answered it well. I'm not sure, but we'll find out.
That's all right. I'm sure you answered it very clearly. Then I'll ask a question or questions. How do you to Mamdouh? How do you evaluate the role of Qabilat tribe of Yam? This is a very big question. It is regional and national, domestic, in the war on Yemen, or the war to establish or re-establish the legitimate government of Hadi. How do you evaluate the role of the tribe from a perspective of political violence, or from perspective of stability, or a perspective of security? How do you evaluate the tribe, and how your evaluation leads your argument further, please?
Well, I'm not specifically an expert on the war on Yemen and the coalition to bring back stability in Yemen, but just like being Saudi and from here, and I know for a fact that tribes that live near the border to Yemen, maybe the government can work with these tribes in convincing others on the other side, the Yemeni part, to just bring back their country, bring back the stability, and that's what I can answer, because I didn't delve into the issues and all the intricacies of in Yemen.
I know, yeah. So do you think that the example of Yam and South and Ismaili is singular in Saudi Arabia, that it cannot be seen in any other region in the?
No, definitely, it can be seen. Yes. Oh, yes, definitely. in Iraq, Shammar, in Aniza, yes, الحويطات but no, الحويطات are Sunni in Jordan, and but yeah, in Iraq, yes, Aniza and Shammar, yes, you have some of them are Shiites and some of them are Sunnis. So yes, you do have that, but what, again, like going back to my argument, what brings them like together, if it's the tribe itself, you know, the Arab culture that binds them more than, of course, sectarianism, which separates them.
Okay, I see. All right. Then the geopolitical issue trumps the domestic one when it comes to activating the cleavages. Yeah?
Yes.
I see the hand of Simon Maben. So is it a question? Yeah, this is the second part of a question for Hessa. What suggestions you have for scholars working on the Gulf, wishing to circumvent the issues that you identify?
Yeah, I just those were just my two recommendations with Amar Shahabi and Adam Hania.
All right, fair enough.
Sorry.
Fair. All right. Okay. So, Edward, you don't see any other new aspects coming out of the Iranian foreign policy, out of the same rhetoric and the same heroes and the same ethos and the same symbolism? Is there anything new to attract the masses in the Middle East? Anything
new?
Any soft power tool or any attractiveness tool rather than the axis of resistance? I
think the axis of resistance serves a purpose for Iran and its national security concerns at the moment, and as we sort of alluded to beforehand with the question about opening up, I think there's avenues for doing that by adopting what Iran has always seen as an inclusive approach to that, you know, which is why it tries to pitch it in those very broad terms. And you know, we have elements of the axis of resistance doing the same thing, you know, in their own ways. If you look at Hezbollah pitching, you know, lots of their message in terms of national struggles, national terms in Lebanon as well. So it's not always, you know, coming back to core religious concerns necessarily. So I think that is, you know, their avenues which are pursued. Iran also has very active diplomacy and cultural diplomacy looking the other way. It's an area my research has looked into, as you know, in terms of Central Asia, in terms of its links with South Asia as well. And so, you know, if you look historically, for example, the ICRO have been very active in Pakistan. They had the largest number of their centres there, although a few have closed down, and also in Central Asia as well. So that's, you know, where the other element, you know, perhaps less, you know, religious-based and more based on nationalist kind of conceptions can come across as well.
Precisely meant actually by using the other tools that the tools using the Caspian Sea, the stuff they are using in Central Asia, they are really different than the stuff they are using in the Arab Middle East. So that which
is why it's important not to, you know, look, you know, through a very narrow prism. I think, you know, it's far too easy to just assume that everything is reductible to religion or everything is reductible to geopolitics. You know, the truth is much messier, more complex and fascinating, as is the case for many countries.
Definitely. So on that very wise note on politics and its continuation of changing. No, there is another question out of Simon, Eddie, and I think is this the last one. How might ideas of resistance change if there is a reduced U.S. involvement in the region? Would it increase with the regard to Israel and Gulf monarchies, or would it lose its resonance? It would lose its logic, meaning without the U.S. appearance in the region.
Thanks, Simon. I was hoping I might be able to get away early for a early lunch break then. My stomach is rumbling and now you've kept me on. No, it's a very good question. So if there's a reduced, I think, it's something that was touched on in one of the papers yesterday as well. I think with Olivia and Luciano's excellent paper which talked about a similar question was asked, and you know, is the raison d'etre gone then if there's no, you know, or a reduced US presence? I mean, the US presence isn't going anywhere soon, but you know, there's a sense that is coming down, and I think this is where, you know, we see Iran probably trying to make common cause with other states who are maybe fearful of that reduction. So we have the sense of Saudi Arabia feeling, you know, abandoned in light of the attacks on the oil refineries, for example. You know, the US didn't really come to its aid then, you know, so I think you might see a kind of agile attempt to kind of say, look, you know, they've not helped you out in the past. let's, you know, it's kind of club together, although on our terms. So I think it would, you know, Israel is always going to be a factor within that. I think we might see it, you know, doubling down on that focus, and you know, the kind of Syrian conflict and Israel's actions there will mean, you know, in terms of bombing Iranian positions within Syria, will mean that it maintains that element, that side of the resistance narrative will still be there as long as the status quo exists in that regard, I think.
Perfect. Those intellectuals never get tired of curiosity. So another question, I believe it's the last, to Dr. Mamdouh. What could you recommend for me, any literature on Saudi Arabian national role conceptions since 1979, either Arabic or English as well? So domestic political books that talks to the culture and the society and the identity of Saudi Arabia. Dr. Mamdouh, please recommend.
I would, well, in comparative politics, Kairan Chaudhry, which I'm sad to say that she passed away. She's a political scientist at UC Berkeley, and she does a lot of work. She had done a lot of work on Saudi Arabia. Another one would be Stefan Hertog, okay, well known. And who else? If I'm not butchering his name, it's Steig or Steg Stencil. He did a very, very interesting. I think it was his dissertation on Saudi Arabia's regime stability. So these three authors I would recommend.
Yeah, you got your authors, yeah, Omar. So that's I think that's how we wrap it up over here. Next session we will have a excellent one on also Middle Eastern issues regarding sectarianism and theoretical issues. I don't exactly know the name of the panel, so I'm just guessing. Just in an hour, we'll be with you in the second panel, on the next panel. Edward, if you have any information to add, please.
I have. I'm chairing it, fortunately. So, so I've got a short break, and then it's domestic and foreign policy and a change in Turkey. So looking at the Turkish side of things and foreign policy and domestic policy. Yeah.
Sounds excellent. So let's meet you in the next panel, and then the remarks by Simon. We had a great time today in this panel. I learned a lot. I'm very happy with the engagement and with the diversity of the audience and the diversity of the intellectual work we are getting out here in Sabat. I hope that other academics and other institutions also follow suit in giving the opportunities to young scholars and the scholars from different regions to speak on topics, even though they might, you know, just take them on the hand a little bit, you know, they might grow, but they just need a little push. Thank you very much. Please join us in the next session.